And you know what? Let's keep that ocean theme going. We're going to head to Australia now. We've got Colin Simpfendorfer joining us. He's a marine biologist with a keen interest in providing the science that informs improved conservation outcomes for sharks and their relatives. So as a diver myself, I can't wait for this talk. There's nothing better than being in the water with sharks. So he's worked in Australia and the United States and collaborates with scientists around the world. Currently, he's an adjunct professor at James Cook University in Australia. And he's joining us to talk a little bit about the work he's doing. We're going to talk a little bit about sharks and stingrays and how they use mangrove forests. So let's bring him in here. Hey, Colin, how are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you, John. Yourself?
Good, good. Thanks so much for joining us. I know, are you on Orpheus Island? Is that where you are right now?
I am on Orpheus Island, yeah, out on the Great Barrier Reef. It's a beautiful place, and great to be talking to you from here.
Oh, no, of course, of course. And how's the field work going? I know you're out there, you're in the field. How's it going?
It's going great. You know, we're out here mostly downloading equipment. We've got a bunch of acoustic receivers all the way through the mangrove forest, and so we're downloading those. But we're also putting out a few transmitters as well. So we've been catching cowtail stingrays, and I was fortunate enough this morning to actually see a porcupine ray, which is our first for here on Orpheus Island. So we've got a picture of that one right at the end for everybody who's watching.
Oh, excellent, excellent. And looks like you have some company with you too.
We've got a couple of students here watching along in the background. So yeah, they're part of the work here, and yeah, really important part of what we do. You know, the students are really the engine room of a lot of the science that we do.
Excellent. Well, Colin, let's let you take over for a little bit. I'm very excited to learn more about the research, get into some sharky action. It's going to be a good time.
No problem. Let me share my screen and we'll be away.
Sounds good. Okay, I see it loading. All right, let's go full screen.
Let's go. There we go. Okay, how's that look?
Colin, let's try and share in a different way because it's shared, but it didn't go full screen for us. So if you retry the screen share, but this time pick the option for the entire screen, it tends to go full screen a little bit better that way.
Okay, let me do that.
Oh man, I'm so jealous right now. We're just in the Seychelles looking at that beautiful water, and then now out on the Great Barrier Reef, and I'm here in Canada with the cold Great Lakes. And I mean, the shipwrecks are really good, but it is fun to be in the warm water and see the profusion of marine life.
Okay, here we go. Let's try that. Now we need to find that and that. How's that look, Joe?
Oh yeah, that's full screen. We're good to go.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. And I'm going to talk about sharks in the mangroves. So two things that I've had a great deal of passion for over my career, particularly the sharks, but have this real fascination with mangroves. And I want to talk about the intersection of these two things today. And I want to start by saying thank you to a whole host of people who have made this really possible. What you're going to see today is a culmination of a lot of work by a lot of people. And I'm just going to be talking about it today. So thanks to a whole host of people, many of them are listed here, and you'll see them in some of the photos as we go through as well. And so mangroves are those trees that live both on the land and in the sea, at that junction between where the ocean meets the land, and really important habitat in both terrestrial and marine sort of sense. One of the things that is very noticeable when you look at mangroves, you know, they're trees, but they also have these very extensive root systems, and that becomes quite important as we get into understanding the relationship between sharks and mangroves. But really, the other important point about mangroves is that we've seen a lot of loss of mangroves globally over the last 50 years. In fact, they've estimated about 35% of the area of mangroves has been lost, and obviously that's continuing, and that's because of things like, you know, coastal development, aquaculture facilities being developed, those sorts of things, but also climate. Changing climate is also seeing in loss of mangroves. And so there's some real challenges that we're facing in terms of our mangrove forests globally. And so obviously that has implications for sharks that may rely on those mangroves as well. But it's important to think about how sharks see mangroves, and this is how a shark would see a mangrove, and this is obviously the underwater view. And there's this root habitat, which you can see is very complex. But there's also things like little fish and invertebrates that live in those mangroves as well, and obviously could represent food for those sharks as well. And so when we think about mangroves and why sharks would use mangroves, there's a number of things that come to mind. Obviously, that complex habitat can really help smaller sharks hide away from predators, big sharks and bigger fish that might be cruising around looking to eat them. They can get into those roots and actually find some real good protection. We also know that mangroves are really productive systems, and so maybe sharks are in there eating the things that live inside the mangrove forest, or also taking advantage of food webs that are driven by mangrove productivity. These are powerhouses of productivity in our coastal systems, and really important food webs that depend on them. And then another possibility is that sharks may gain some physiological advantage in the mangroves. Being shady means that they may stay cooler in summer and give them a place to go with that, particularly in really warm tropical areas where mangroves are quite common. This might actually be something that they can take advantage of. And of course, all of those things are not mutually exclusive. And so there's a whole range of possibilities as to why they do this. And so where do mangroves occur? The black areas here on the map show where mangroves occur, and obviously extensive through mostly the tropical, but also some of the subtropical parts globally. And I want to talk about a couple of different locations and a couple of different sharks today. I'll start with small-toothed sawfish in the Florida Everglades, then move over to northern Western Australia here in Australia, talk about dwarf sawfish, and then wrap up by talking about our work here on Orpheus Island, where we've been looking at 3 species of sharks: it's mangrove whip ray, the cowtail ray, and the black-tip reef shark. And importantly, all of these species are globally listed on the IUCN Red List as threatened. And so obviously making sure that these populations are looked after and recovered obviously is important. And if they have good, strong relationships with mangroves, then obviously looking after mangroves is an important part of that recovery. So let's start with small-toothed sawfish. I'm going to talk about this one particular small-toothed sawfish you see in the picture here that Tonya Wiley is releasing. This is a baby sawfish. They grow up to 4 or 5 meters in length. This guy's just a couple of months old, and we've just fitted it with an acoustic transmitter. And that transmitter puts out a little ping that on a regular basis that we can follow around and track the movements of the animal. And so that's exactly what we did. We caught it on this mud bank. You can see the mangroves in the background, and it spent the low tide swimming backwards and forwards along the edge of this mud bank. And as the tide started to rise towards the mangroves, the sawfish started to move in closer to the mangroves, and then suddenly we lost the signal. It was gone, and we're like, did something eat it? Did the tag fail? What's going on? We didn't really understand. And so we drove backwards and forwards along the mud bank trying to find this animal, and with its tag pinging away, and were unsuccessful. And then we noticed, and you can just see it here in the middle of the picture, there's this little channel that runs back into the mangroves. And we thought, well, maybe, just maybe, this animal has swum back into the mangroves. And of course, it's not easy getting back in there. And so we went away, came back the next day. We found ourselves a canoe, and we developed what we called off-road canoeing, basically venturing back inside the mangroves in these little creeks. Wasn't easy going, but a lot of fun. And lo and behold, when you do that, you get back into these areas, and we found our sawfish swimming around in the back here on the high tide, mostly resting in amongst these roots. And so it spent its time on high tide up in here, and then on the low tide, as the water fell out of the mangrove roots, it would swim out back onto that mud bank again. And we tracked it on several tidal cycles, and it did the same thing every time. And so this was clearly part of its behavior and part of what it was doing. And this is one of the reasons we think it was doing it. This is a bull shark. This one's about 4 or 5 feet long, and these animals are really common in this area of the Everglades. And so we think these bull sharks would love to have a little baby sawfish for lunch. So the sawfish obviously are hiding away, trying to keep away and safe from these predators. And so we actually, after we tracked this one little baby sawfish, we actually went off and tracked a whole range of other ones and they all did the same sort of thing. They spend a lot of time on the low tide around mud banks, and then as the tide rises, they actually get up into the mangroves, hiding away from these predators that are really common along that Everglades coast. And so that was our first sort of hint about, the interaction between sharks and mangroves. And clearly refugeeing from predators was what looked like was quite important. And so let's now move to Western Australia. So the Kimberley Coast, this is a really remote part of Australia. There are really no major human communities, a couple of Indigenous outposts in this part of the world, but very, very low population density, very undeveloped. And the ocean here is an amazing place because it's very underexploited. I'm going to talk about dwarf sawfish. Now, don't let the name fool you. Dwarf sawfish are not that dwarf. This one you can see tied next to the boat here is about 2 meters long, and that's about the size that they start to mature. In terms of sawfish, that's quite small, but certainly not dwarf by most people's standards. And this is the first dwarf sawfish we caught on our work up here in the Kimberley quite a few years ago now, but it was a really interesting sort of experience. And again, we fitted it with an acoustic tag, let us follow it around. And this animal, we actually followed around for about 54 hours. And I've got the track here. It's not super clear, but hopefully you can get an idea of what was going on. We started the track up here where it says start. And then the red line is where the tide was falling. And then the black line is where the tide is rising. And so you can see as we've tracked the animal on the rising tide, it would come back into the mangroves in this little white box area here, spend the high tide here in the mangroves, and then go back out along this mud bank. And it did that repeatedly as we tracked it. And every single high tide, it would come back into the mangroves. And the panel on the right-hand side here is the location of where it spent those high tides, and very, very close together. In fact, normally within about 50 meters of the previous high tide spot was where they would end up back. And so, clearly not only liking the mangroves, but very specific locations within the mangroves, which was really interesting and actually surprised us quite a bit. And this is what those mangroves look like. Obviously, what you would expect, trees, flooded. And this part of the world in the Kimberley has massive tides, 12-meter tides on a daily basis. And so, on the high tide, these mangroves are flooded sometimes up to almost the tops of the trees. And then on the low tide, the tide runs out several kilometres. And so the sawfish really are just following that edge of the water backwards and forwards. And then when the tide gets high, comes into the mangroves, and they would actually just sit on the bottom between these mangrove trees. When we were tracking them, we would sit there in the boat. We wouldn't move the boat for 4 hours. We'd tie up to a tree and just listen to the tag ping away. And then as the tide was getting lower, we would follow them back out. And again, thinking about why they did that, two things came to mind very quickly because we saw both of them quite a lot in that area. One was estuarine crocodiles. These are obviously big crocodiles. They love to eat sawfish. And so that's a good reason to hide away when you can. And obviously the other one was big sharks. We saw a bunch of things like this big tiger shark in that location as well. And so clearly, again, these guys are hiding out in the mangroves, probably avoiding these big predators. And interestingly, this is not the youngest of the sawfish. These animals are quite old. Some of them are adults, and they're still refuging away from these predators. So clearly avoiding getting eaten is a really important part of why sharks are using mangroves. And that brings us to where we are today, here on Orpheus Island on the Great Barrier Reef. This is Orpheus Island looking from the north. A beautiful spot, one of the inshore islands on the Great Barrier Reef, surrounded by coral reef, but also, thankfully for our purposes, also lots and lots of mangroves. And this is the mangroves actually right out in front of the research station where we are. And you can see, these really complex root habitats, obviously in abundance. And one of the really nice things about being here at Orpheus Island is that the water is actually much clearer than where you would see at most places that have mangroves. And so that gives us a real opportunity to study these animals in a lot more detail. And so we've spent about the last 10 years here looking into quite a bit of research about the way these animals are interacting with the mangroves. And 3 species, just to refresh our memories, mangrove whipray, the cowtail ray, and the black-tip reef shark. They're our 3 main focal species here. All of them are quite common. And while their global populations are threatened, here in Australia, all of them are relatively secure. And so we have plenty of these animals, and it gives us a great opportunity to learn about them somewhere where they're common, so that we can transfer some of those learnings to other places where we need to actually work hard to save these species. And so we've done a lot of work here. I'm going to talk about some of the types of work we've done, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. But one of the first things we did was actually walking surveys, where we'd get into the mangroves, we'd walk around on the higher tides and look at where the animals are. And these are all mangrove whiprays. And those surveys showed us very clearly that this species in particular really likes being in the mangroves, and it will actually spend lots of time inside the mangroves on the high tides. But they do occur obviously outside the mangroves, particularly when the tide is low. The other thing we've done is a lot of work tracking the movements of these species. These are actually tracks from cowtail stingrays. There's 6 different animals tracked a couple of times each. And from this sort of information, we've built up a really great understanding of where these animals go, and you know, the types of habitats that they're using. And clearly, one of the things that really drives their movement here is the tide. The tide varies by about 4 meters from high to low. And so obviously creates quite a lot of movement. The mangroves are only available on the higher part of the higher half of the tide. And so animals that are using the mangroves obviously have to find something else to do when the water isn't inside the mangroves. And this tracking has really given us an understanding of what these animals get up to. And just to summarize some of the outcomes from that tracking work, first of all, clearly all 3 of these species enter mangroves. We see them all inside mangroves, and from time to time at least. But it's only the mangrove whiprays and the black-tip reef sharks that preferentially spend most of the high tides inside the mangroves. Cowtails seem to be somewhat indifferent about that. The other thing we've done is a whole bunch of video surveys, where we basically put GoPro cameras up in the mangrove trees looking down, and also outside of mangrove habitats looking down, trying to understand, you know, the time that the species spend in different parts, different types of habitat here at the island, and particularly, you know, how they're using these mangrove areas. And you can see in this grab from one of the videos, this is 3 mangrove whiprays, very distinctive because they have these nice white tails, which really make them stand out. They also have lots of white freckles on the upper surface, so quite a pretty little ray. Using these video surveys, we're able to count numbers inside these different habitats, look at how long they're there, what they're up to, those sorts of things. And after students looking at many hours of video, we've come to some really useful conclusions based on that work. One of those is that both mangrove whiprays and black-tip reef sharks are regularly inside the mangroves, and obviously the black-tip reef sharks are always moving, and in fact the mangrove whiprays also move around quite a bit when they're inside the mangroves as well. The video analysis also showed that cowtail stingrays don't actually preferentially use mangroves. They're somewhat indifferent about the habitat in which they occur. And really interesting, one of the things that the video analysis also showed was that large sharks, which are the main predator of these smaller sharks and stingrays here at Orpheus, are extremely rare inside the mangroves. And so this is really a predator-free habitat for these little guys, and so a place that they can actually stay really safe. And so, you know, it's really nice to get some data that helps us really cement that understanding of why they're in the mangroves. But also importantly, the video lets us understand what they get up to, and we certainly were able to see mangrove whiprays feeding inside the mangroves. The other species not so much, but certainly mangrove whiprays will feed when they're here in the mangroves. We've also done a bunch of diet and isotope analysis to help us understand what's going on in terms of the food webs and that they're connected to here at the island, and whether the stingrays and the sharks actually are powered by these mangrove food webs. And so the picture here is a couple of the students actually fitting transmitters to these animals and taking biopsies of tissue. The animals are released back into the wild, obviously swim around, create data, but we can take the tissue that we take from them, analyze that to understand the food webs that they're part of. And so the results from that part of our work actually shows that both the mangrove whiprays and the cowtail rays don't actually use that mangrove-derived carbon that we see coming out of those trees. And so that for us was quite interesting. While they are in the mangroves, they don't actually use those food webs. And then finally, we've done some physiology work as well, and mostly on mangrove whiprays. This is one that we've fitted with a temperature logger. So it's recording its temperature. We release them out into the wild for a few weeks, catch them again, take the loggers off and look at the temperatures that they'd been swimming around in. We also did some physiology studies and helped us understand that that these mangrove whiprays actually select habitat to stay warm when it's cool, and then stay cool when it's hot. And they actually get inside the mangroves where they're shady and the water temperature is slightly cooler to help them avoid the really high temperatures that we see in summer in these really shallow intertidal areas. I'm going to skip over this one. That's just a summary of what I've just sort of told you, but it shows that we've got a whole range of evidence for different traits of these three species here at Orpheus Island. And then finally, essentially, and hopefully what I've been able to show you today is that, you know, we have a whole range of sharks in our oceans that are threatened. Some of them are really, mangroves are important in terms of how they do things and that are important to them. And so to help save some of these species of sharks, we're really also going to have to save the mangroves because we're losing those as well at quite a rapid rate. And so there's this interdependency between these two groups of threatened organisms, the sharks and the mangroves, and we're going to have to make sure that we do a much better job into the future of looking after both of those. And with that, this is the guy I ran into on my snorkel this morning. This is a porcupine ray. First time we've seen it here in the mangroves at Orpheus Island, but beautiful animal and a real privilege to get to snorkel with him this morning. So that's it from me in terms of my talk.
All right, very cool. Not a bad way to spend the morning to get to see something like that.
No, exactly. And you know, I was very, very thankful to run into him and really surprised, but you know, he seemed really chilled and was just sitting there to actually feeding inside the mangroves. And it was really just nice to see that happening and just spend a bit of time with that guy.
Oh yeah, no question. Very, very cool. And what great work. I love the sawfish. Obviously they are very endangered, but I mean, it's just so neat to kind of get that little glimpse into their life that you can get with the acoustic trackers. And then a fun mystery too, like where did it go? Why did it disappear? And then to track it down and learn something new about their behavior.
Well, yeah, exactly. You know, you know, as a scientist, there are some days in your career that are really defining, and that was one of them. You know, just to really, you know, get this understanding that these mangroves are actually really critical in terms of what they're up to, you know, was eye-opening and actually helped direct a lot of the work that we did from then on. And, you know, we know that, you know, in terms of saving small-toothed sawfish in the US, you know, mangroves are intertwined with that conservation process. And if we don't do both, you know, sawfish don't really have that much of a future.
Yeah, I mean, that root structure is just such an amazing nursery, a great little world for them to kind of tuck themselves away.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and it's amazing when you actually, you know, and snorkeling here at Orpheus inside those mangrove habitats, which is, you know, it's not something you can do many places in the world. You know, yeah. It's fascinating to watch these animals, how they behave and how they react to things. And, you know, to see these little animals, you know, stingrays, some of them are, you know, getting to be a reasonable size, squeezing themselves through those gaps in the mangroves is fascinating. And it's, you know, it's clearly somewhere they want to be and they're really well adapted to using it.
Yeah. So, you know, you're using that acoustic system where you can kind of track their movements. Why that as opposed to something like satellite tags? Is it an expense kind of thing or the size of the shark?
So partly it's the size. Certainly, you know, these are mostly small animals. You know, they won't be big enough to tow a satellite tag or something like that. And it's also that these are animals that don't surface very much. So we have actually used satellite tags, though. And so I had a student, Anna Martins, and I think Anna's currently in Halifax in Canada, but she told me she was going to be up for this talk. So hey, if you're listening, Anna, hi. But Anna developed this amazing system where we put little satellite tags on floats, and the stingrays actually towed them around, so we didn't actually have to follow them, and that they would just swim around on the reef flat and come back to the mangroves, and we were able to actually watch them as they they swam around, and catch them again, pull the transmitter off. In fact, the transmitter would usually, or the satellite tag would come off inside the mangrove somewhere, and away we go, so we didn't have to trudge around the reef flat following these guys all the time. Anna just sort of let them go and collected the data several hours later.
Yeah. So there's definitely some benefits to that.
Oh, absolutely. And very precise data. And it was, there were some real challenges in developing that. These are very, very small, satellite tags, but, that normally go on things like birds. But, getting them onto a float and setting it up to get towed around worked out really, really well.
Yeah. So I'm curious where you are right now at the research station. How is that ecosystem? Is it a nice, healthy ecosystem? Good numbers of the black tips and the rays?
Oh, absolutely. It's we're very thankful. It's part of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. The area here is zoned basically as a no-take zone around the island, largely to support the research that goes on here. And we've been tracking, the black tips, not only the babies that occur in the mangroves, but also the adults. And, most of them stay around the island for pretty much their whole life. Occasionally they'll wander off and that, but they'll often come back. But yeah, the system here is in great shape, and that's makes it actually much easier to do this work. Working on sawfish in Florida, where these things are at very low levels of population. We sometimes went months without actually even seeing one. While we were out there fishing a lot and trying to catch them. But it's a challenge working with some of these threatened species because they're just not that available.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then what I think is great is the work you're doing and being at stations like that. It's just a great opportunity for the next generation to learn the ropes, get some experience, launch new projects. So very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Students are a really important part of what we do, and it's great to be able to work with them and get them up to speed on the types of work that can be done, and really get them going in their careers. It's one of the real highlights of a career at universities.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I am not going to lie to you. I'm a little bit jealous of where you are right now. I lived in Australia for a year. That's where I learned to dive. It was a pretty spectacular year. So I can just imagine, there's some real fringe benefits to the job.
Absolutely there are, Joe, and you're welcome back anytime.
All right. Good stuff. Well, a huge shout out to Colin. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing in multiple continents to protect the sharks, because, they are just an amazing species. Anytime you can be in the water with a shark is generally a great experience. And they're so important to the ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems need those sharks. We need those top predators. So
absolutely.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and don't have too much fun out there.
We'll try and hold ourselves back a little bit.
All right. Thanks so much, Colin.
Thanks, Joe. See you guys.
See ya. Thank you.